Hey, everybody out there in comic book land. It's time once again for Whatcha Readin. People ask me all the time, as a world famous, world renowned comic book writing superstar, they ask me, hey, when you're not writing, what are you reading? And I do read quite a bit. I'm a compulsive reader. And so I thought I'd share a book that I just completed. I just finished reading. It's a book called Carl Barks Conversations. It's from the University of Mississippi Press, and it's a collection of, I guess, every interview ever held, or every known interview ever held with Carl Barks, the comic book writer and artist, who is justifiably most famous for his work on Dell Comics, Donald Duck, and Uncle Scrooge. He is the creator of Uncle Scrooge, Gyro Gearloose, Magic at the Spell. He is the architect of the Donald Duck universe. And in addition to that, he invented comic book writing. He showed us all how to write a comic book. He was really the very first creator to take the medium seriously, to not look upon it as sort of a bastard stepchild of the newspaper comic strip, but to look upon it as a medium all of its own. And he treated it with that amount of respect at a time when comic books were the lowest of lowbrow entertainment. Most of the people, the vast majority of the people creating the comics and publishing the comics, just thought, this is just disposable crap we're turning out. But Barks didn't see it that way. He took his job very seriously. He took his readers very seriously and created these indelible, timeless stories that sold in the millions. Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge, at the peak of their powers in the early 50s, were selling 3 million copies a month each. That's 6 million comic books Carl Barks was selling for Dell Comics, in addition to vacation specials and annuals and one-shots and everything else. He was quite prolific for a guy who was writing and drawing all this stuff. But who is Carl Barks? He was born in Oregon, grew up with a farm family, and this farm life and sort of the hard scrabble existence of the beginning of the 20th century, they form the groundwork and really inform everything that Barks creates. He has a work ethic. He was taking a cartooning course when he was in high school. Actually, he left high school. He left school at 13 to work the farm. When he was taking a cartooning correspondence course in 1913 and 14. And when World War I came along, there was a shortage of men. And so he stopped taking the correspondence course. He quit the correspondence school because he could make $5 a day assisting on farms other than his own. So he was working his family's farm as a teenager, his father's farm, and then when he was done his work there, he would go to other farms or go work at a sawmill. And this is a hardworking guy who knew the value of a dollar, much like Uncle Scrooge. And all of this informs his work. And so when he gets a break to work for Disney Studios, where he worked for a while as an in-betweener, and then eventually moved into the story department, where he came up with gags, and he was put into the Donald Duck division because he had come up with a gag with Donald Duck in a barber chair. Walt encouraged everyone to come up with gags. It didn't matter what your position was at Disney. He said, I'll buy a joke, I'll buy a gag from anybody. And Barks, working as an in-betweener, came up with this gag involving Donald and a barber chair, and Walt loved it so much. They built an entire 7-minute cartoon around the gag, And Walt gave Barks $50, which back in the 30s was a lot of money. So um, Disney realized that Barks was an idea man, gag man, moved him into the gag department, story department, where he worked for a number of years creating Donald Duck cartoons. But he didn't really like animation, and he really, really didn't like the Walt Disney Studios. They were causing the air conditioning there. He felt was causing him to have a sinus condition, so he quit Disney, moved to the desert in California, in San Jacinto, and his allergies clear up, his sinuses clear up, but what's he going to do for a living? He buys some chickens. And he's going to have a chicken ranch, and that's how this guy would have been perfectly happy spending the rest of his life, raising chickens, selling eggs, selling chickens, and but he hears from Disney again that Western Publishing is going to begin publishing comic books under their Dell label, featuring Walt Disney characters. Western was going to pay the money for the Disney license, and they needed stories. They needed artists. So Barks tries out. He draws a few stories written by other people, but he takes the stories, sort of makes them his own, makes changes, all the rest of it. And the rest is history. He gets hired on to be the permanent guy working on Donald Duck comics. Now he does other things. He does some Barney Bear comics for Dell. He does some Looney Tunes, but as he confesses, he couldn't draw Bugs Bunny to save his life. He just never understood how to draw bugs. So they stick him with ducks, and he's fine with that. And he writes and draws, hundreds of Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge stories for the next few decades. And he talks a lot in the book about his work, his day-to-day work. And he basically works solitary. His second wife would draw panel borders and fill in blacks for him. His third wife was actually an accomplished letterer. And so she would do all of that stuff, panel borders, fill in blacks, and do the lettering. And Barks basically just lived a solitary life. He never traveled anywhere until he was much older. He went on a world tour. He went on a European tour because he was celebrated. Because Barks didn't get to sign his work and everything was attributed to Walt Disney, it took fans of the work to recognize, hey, there are good duck stories and okay duck stories. And the good duck stories all have this one tell in common. It's the little bit of whiteout that Barks would use to make a slice in the pupils of his character's eyes, so you could tell which way they were looking. And this became, basically unwittingly his way of signing his work. And so he began to, these fans worked as detectives and they sought him out. And eventually his name got known throughout fandom. And so we got to know who Carl Barks was, what his contribution was. And through these interviews, we learned more and more about him. As a comic book writer, I was fascinated because he shared a lot of opinions with me, largely about how he looked upon the audience for these books. He didn't say as much, but he was writing these for the same imaginary reader I write a lot of my comic book stories for, a precocious 10-year-old. And he thought kids were smart. Kids didn't want to be pandered to. He never wrote down to them. And so he constructed just these amazing stories. If you've never read Barks, you really should. He put so much time and effort into having these stories be not only entertaining and funny, but also, compellingly readable and so perfectly constructed. His stories are so perfectly constructed where everything makes sense. His setups are sublime and they always pay off at the end of the story. He was great with running gags. all kinds of things. But through these interviews, we see his process, and he was largely left alone. They very seldom made changes to his stories. Once they made him change a story, and then the publisher looked at both versions, his original version and the change version, and said, no, his instincts were right in the beginning. And from that point on, they pretty much left him alone, except in a few occasions where he made a story too violent for Donald Duck. He has one memorable bar fight. He had Uncle Scrooge in a bar fight in Alaska, and Del felt it was a little too brutal. When you look at the art, it's not. It's perfectly harmless cartoon violence. But they would just sort of cut that scene, and he never knew what they were going to cut and what they were going to keep. He learned after a while to draw extra panels that could be deleted without affecting the story pacing, things like this. All of the mechanics, all of these things that he had to think about, and he's really thinking about these things for the first time, taking this medium seriously. He's the first guy to really take this medium seriously. And remember, he's an adult at this time. Young punks like Jack Kirby and Joe Simon and guys like that were going to show up later, but they were young kids with a dream. They had adolescent passion on their side. This is a grown man, a working cartooning professional, and he's really putting more effort into these comics than his employers are asking him to. In fact, he addresses something that, and he uses a word that I often use describing comic book editors. He said there was an indifference to the comics by the people creating them, that they didn't seem to love comics or like comics or respect comics, and they were largely indifferent to all of it. They didn't care about the audience. They didn't seem to care about the sales. They couldn't look upon these things and say, we are selling millions and millions and millions of comic books. Maybe we ought to think about this, about how to maintain this readership. He said they never gave that a thought for 1 second. And he very rarely ever brought these things up. He was not a big advocate for his own work. Very, very humble man who held no resentment that he was selling millions and millions of copies, but was making about $50 a page for everything, story, art, everything. He's delivering the complete stories for $50 a page, and he does this for decades. Never gets a raise. Royalties are never even thought of. There's no incentives. There's no bonuses. They don't even send him comp copies. He has to go to the store and buy his own comics. So this indifference, and the only time he apparently spoke up was he did a story in which Donald and his nephews are involved with a forest fire. It's a terrific story. It's suspenseful and everything else, and it shows how to survive a forest fire, the dangers of a forest fire, the threat to the wildlife, the threat to the environment, and more specifically, the threat to Donald and his nephews, and what they do to survive. And he said to Del, he says, you should do something with this story because I feel it's important. And I feel it should get wider distribution. If you could work with like the United States Forestry Service or something like that, they'd probably love to print, millions of these and give them away in schools and things like that. And he said, but Del wasn't at all interested. And this is something in my career I've run into over and over and over again. I've done entire videos about how many times DC, particularly DC and Marvel, have missed golden opportunities to promote their publications. It wouldn't have cost them a dime, but they just didn't seem to care. And Barks expresses these opinions. So for me, as a comic creator, this stuff was terrific to read. Yeah, he was a bit of a pill. He was a bit of a prickly pear. You didn't want to get on his bad side. But he was a different kind of guy, and from a different kind of era. And like I said, his hard scrabble, I hate that term, but his hard scrabble, his tough upbringing, which back then everybody's upbringing was tough. Unless you came from money, you had to work your ass off. That's just the way the world was. And all of that, to see how all of that goes into the creation of these characters and their own ethics and his own personality and beliefs expressed through these characters. One funny story: he rarely ever got letters, and in the early days, and Dell would send them along, and they sent along one letter from a woman who was complaining about a very famous Bark story in which Uncle Scrooge gets in competition with a Maharaja to see who could build the biggest statue of themselves in Duckburg. And Scrooge and this Maharaja, they're building more and more enormous structures. It just gets ludicrous, as so many Bark stories do. They take absurdity to the limit. And of course, there's always somewhat of a lesson in there about humility and hubris. But he never leaned, and he's never a message guy. But anyway, this woman writes that this story was terrible for children. And she didn't find it funny at all, because wouldn't it be better if these two, with all of their millions and millions of dollars, if they had used that money more constructively to build hospitals and schools and things like that? And Barks actually wrote back to her and said that she was looking at this all the wrong way, because Scrooge and the Maharaja were employing armies of contractors and concrete men and artisans and sculptors to create these statues, that they're spending money to grow the economy of Duckburg was of far more benefit than simply building a hospital or school. That probably their efforts resulted in more schools and more hospitals being built, because the tax base of Duckburg would grow. And it's like, boy, this is my kind of guy. But to take that time and to put that much thought into what his employers and many of his fellow creators saw as just, junk entertainment. My hat's off to you, Brother Barks. And he also has an insight into Walt Disney. Because he worked in the story department, the gag department, he had access to Walt Disney. He saw Walt Disney quite a bit. Walt would come to the story department. As Barks says, he would always announce that he was coming, because he didn't want them always thinking he was going to drop in by surprise, because they were all afraid of Walt, not because Walt was not a nice guy, but because Walt was their employer. And Walt was like the cock of the walk in animation in those days. This was the place you wanted to work, and you wanted to stay there, and you wanted to please Walt. And I don't think Walt was looking for people to please him, but he would come into the story department and make suggestions and ask them what was going on. And Bark said that his suggestions for gags and changes in stories were always good, always well thought out. And if there was some disagreement from the story guys and animators, they would make their case. And, a lot of times Walt would go, okay, well, you're right. Maybe your instincts are better here than mine. And Walt would give in. He wasn't a guy who just wanted yes men around him. But the coolest thing he said about Walt is that Walt had ambition to create quality work. It was never about the money. And Barks makes this point a number of times in the book, that Walt went bankrupt a bunch of times in order to create something of quality. That he took risks. He stuck his neck out. It was all about, creative choices to him. That Walt Disney Productions was going to be a powerhouse in entertainment through quality, the quality of their output. And if they had to risk money, even lose money, Walt was willing to do that. And Walt did go bankrupt a number of times. Walt Disney Productions they did not go from success to success. There was a lot of failure and starting over and everything else in the business. And Bark says that Walt was one of these guys. He was a creative guy who had the gumption and the gall and the drive to see his ideas come to fruition. And he said most of us creators, and I'm going to include myself and every other creator, come up with these wacky ideas, but are we going to keep pushing them? Are we going to do the work needed to bring our wacky ideas to life? Or are we just at some point go, yeah, maybe this idea is just too nuts. Maybe I'm crazy, and maybe nobody wants this, and you just sort of give it up, and you feel okay with doing that because you think, well, maybe it wasn't going to succeed. And Walt did not have that gene in his body, apparently, according to Barks. He'd come up with the craziest ideas, and everybody would go, that's nuts, that'll never work, and everything else. And then Walt would go, no, this is how it will work. And he would fight his own staff, many times fight his own brother, because his brother was the bookkeeper, accountant for the company. It was always horrified, the amount of money Walt was spending on things and the amount of effort he put into things. But Walt would see this vision and just work his tail off and work everybody else's tail off in that direction to produce that work. Because you can have all the nutty ideas in the world, and we all have crazy nutty ideas, but to put in the sweat equity to make those things happen is what separates us from guys like Walt Disney or Jack Kirby. Is another example of a personality like that. So there you have it. The life of Carl Barks. If you're interested at all, even if you're not interested in Carl Barks, if you're interested in all in the comics medium, the history of the medium, where it comes from, where it might be going, I suggest you read this book. I thought I knew a lot about Barks, but I learned a lot more through this. I feel like I spent time with the guy because, it was one interview after another, and they grow more and more candid as he gets older. As I get older, I become more and more candid. So anyway, that's what I've been reading. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And